Blended Podcasts. Brought to you by Blended Audio.
ArtPod is a South African-focused visual arts podcast hosted by Claude Chandler. Join me weekly every Saturday as I'm joined by a new guest who occupies a position within the visual arts community, ranging from fine arts, tattooing, framing, and logistics. Welcome to the first episode of ArtPod. I'm your host, Claude Chandler, and today I'm being joined by my good friend and the talented Simon Kennedy. Before I get on with the interview, I would just like to give a bit of background of who I am and how we came to this podcast. I'm a fine artist based in Cape Town. I manage Eastside Studios, a creative collective, an artist-run studio based in Salt River. Originally from Durban, I studied at DUT where I got a national diploma in fine arts and eventually migrated to Cape Town. I came from a background of a family of artists. I almost have the Spider-Man origin story of my parents finding me passed out at the age of 6 next to a jar of turpentine and had to be rushed to the hospital to get my stomach pumped. So maybe you could say that's where the journey started. I kind of dropped out of fine art at university. I got my diploma. I could have carried on for a BTech, but I kind of needed to leave the nest and pursue a fine art career, and I thought Cape Town would be the most appropriate. I had a friend staying here, so I had a bit of a base, and it was definitely a shock to the system. But I always found myself fairly resourceful. I got a job at a place called Art Jamming, and instead of waitering, I decided to stay within the art scene, even if it was on the far edges of the art scene. But it served me pretty well, and it was a great place to work. It was pretty much a studio. We catered for young kids to come in and paint, and then we were also an art retail store. And I hustled and bustled. I painted portraits in malls. I taught privately for young kids. You name it, face painting, balloon animals, I would do it. And eventually I got my big break doing a large commission for a solar energy farm for one of their corporate gigs. And with the money earned from that, I quit my job. I knew I could afford 3 months house rent, 3 months studio rent. And ever since then, it's just kind of picked up momentum, and I've been growing, and I've been a full-time artist now for around 7 years. Simon, about 2 weeks ago, while I was in Durban, contacted me and said, hey, do you want to start this podcast? And it's something I've been very hungry for, especially as an artist in South Africa. There's not enough medium or media on the arts topic or the art genre. So, if it's not there, just do it yourself, and hopefully this grows and turns into something fantastic. And it's great to have Simon as my first guest. He can kind of hold my hand through this this process. But yeah, so for everyone listening, can you just give a little introduction to yourself?
Hi, yeah, well, I think this is a good intro. I guess you can best describe me as a freelance illustrator. I dabble in the arts from time to time, and I've worked a bit with animators. I generally pass myself off as someone who works in the animation industry these days, because you don't need to explain it that long, that much, because it's different to say, they just think you're an animator, basically, rather than saying you're an illustrator in the animation scene. Yes. It's a bit more specialized.
And we met, I think it was 2008 in Durban, DUT. I was studying fine art, you were studying graphic design.
Yes.
Can you just tell us about your first year in university and...
Well, it was chaos, I guess, but in the good, formative kind.
And what was the decision to choosing graphic design?
I guess I like that it seemed to not be all over the place as fine art. I think when you pick a career in fine art, it is quite different. Well, it's still a creative field to graphic design, and I kind of walked both paths. I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to be like a pure fine artist or someone who worked also with more commercial works. And I think I've always been a day walker. I go between both of those.
And unfortunately, I mean, you only stayed for a year at DUT in Durban, and then you went to Australia to continue your studies.
Yes.
Was it an issue of the course not kind of fulfilling your expectations?
Pretty much, yeah.
You wanted something more focused?
I think if you're after something a bit more specific like I am, you do need to find courses that are more tailor-made for your needs. And that tech that we were at DUT just wasn't providing that at the time. Although I would say the graphic design course was quite good. I didn't just want to work in graphic design. So yeah, I looked online, but more specifically, I looked at what other artists I admired, my art heroes in the illustration scene, what they were saying about tertiary education, and I decided I was going to having an Australian passport, which made it way more possible as well, follow where the illustrator Ben Templesmith studied. But the funny thing is, in the interview, he pretty much said to the interviewer, tertiary education isn't so important, but here's where I studied. So with that said, I agree with him, but I followed his footsteps, and it turned out that Curtin University of Technology had a very good illustration course that was half fine art, half graphic design.
Okay. And do you think the kind of the community at the university is really important, or do you think just the kind of the structure of the classes and the knowledge you learn from that's more important? Was there kind of like an alumni now? Do you keep in connection with any of your colleagues?
Funny enough, every now and again, I wouldn't say I'm that regular with it, but I am kind of occasionally in contact with the mentors I had. So, and I come back to this point, you can go to a prestigious institution, but if you don't have mentors that you can really connect with and admire, you're not going to learn as much. And I happen to have basically 3 of those people available to me who really inspired me, and who really could talk to me on a one-on-one level about just the trajectory of my arts career. Yeah, one of them was a man called, his name's Justin Randall. He's in the Australian comic book scene, also I guess just the comic scene in general. He does indie comics, and but I guess that's a lead into the next thing. Sure. Which, if you want to talk about more,
Well, just to finish up on the tertiary education, I mean, after leaving the course, in terms of confidence and prep, did you feel you're entering the marketplace well suited?
Well, I guess that's the thing that these courses often don't prepare people for, is how to exist as a financial body. It's here are the skills, they release you, or they don't, you get, are then just released into the wild pretty much, and you have to find your way from then. So I would say I felt very prepared in terms of skill, but like a total, I guess a virgin in terms of like how those skills apply to the workforce at first.
But I think you get that feedback a lot in any department, and I don't know if it's a thing of kind of you don't want to distort or dilute the kind of the creative aspect, and I think they're hoping that that kind of technique and education will kind of just hopefully feed itself into the marketplace.
Definitely. Well, I mean, it's not their role. They're just there to inspire you and teach you skills, really. But I guess what I think art education should have a bit more of a focus on instead of like a crash unit at the end of third year, is the artistic roles you can play in the professional sphere.
Sure.
And how to connect with people who are other professionals, how to connect with clients, how to get a portfolio together. All those things are very important. I think they should have a bit more of an emphasis on in these courses.
For sure. And I think even with fine arts, the career artist is almost a new concept. Like growing up, all the artists I knew had, a full-time job or a side job, and then they kind of both, they kind of helped carry the art or just ensure that bills were paid. But I think more and more you have artists that just do it full-time and can actually make a career of it. I guess going back to graphic design, in terms of definition, like I would call myself a full-time artist, and you find a lot of graphic artists or draftsmen or illustrators refer to themselves as freelancers. Can you explain that kind of psychology?
I guess it's sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of another. But I do think there are some important distinctions between being a full-time fine artist and I guess a full-time freelance illustrator or graphic designer. And it's more the kinds of clients that you have and where what the kinds of work that you're doing. And now what you'll find is with a lot of freelance graphic designers is they often do fine art on the side, and their bread and butter is something more along the lines of corporate identity work or promotional work, advertising, things like that. And while you can do that with fine art, it's still I guess the patronage sphere is quite different, and the podium that it's on is very different. People look at fine art in a different way, but it's still, again, the overlap's just visual aesthetics at the end of the day.
So you feel more like a gun for hire.
Yeah, that's why the old term freelancer, which literally meant a lines for hire back in the day, it's a mercenary term.
And when I first got to meet you, you were definitely into fantasy, and I know you like D&D and those type of lifestyle, cultural things were a big part of your character. And I think that influenced a lot of your art, correct?
Yes, no, definitely.
And I know you've been working on a project for a long time called Dread Empire. Can you just tell us about, which is a graphic novel, can you just tell me or us about how you got into that?
Okay. Well, I guess where to start, there's a lot there. Let me start with influences, I guess. I think when I first opened a Tintin book at my grandmother's house, I knew this was something I loved and could appreciate. It's something native, I guess, to me is appreciation of line work. Which is very married to design, whether it's architectural or any kind of drafting. But I appreciated Hergé's the crispness, ability to tell a story so articulately, even if I didn't really understand it at the time. And of course, just the sheer fancy of going on those adventures that Tintin would get up to. And of course, other titles like Asterix and Obelix. Some a very strong European influence in fantasy. And then I think built my interest in drawing, and stuff just snowballs, right? Especially if it's something you're interested in. That I guess led to further studying after school. And then getting noticed. I mentioned him before, Justin Randall, who was one of my teachers at university, and he connected me with his publisher, Wolfgang Balsamer, and we met up and we said, he asked if I was interested in producing a graphic novel with their company called Gestalt. It's an Australian comic book company. And yeah, I digitally met up with the writer Christian Reed, and he's responsible for like quite a few comic titles like the Eldritch Kid, and he's done a few other Warhammer kind of related, just content. And just we got along, and I read the script for Dread Empire, and I said, this is something I'd like to do, and I just took it from there. Comics is something I've always done on the side. It's kind of what you were mentioning before about, a lot of fine artists that you knew beforehand would have a job and then they would do fine art on the side. I kind of treat comics that way.
Yes. And when you took on Dread Empire, was that you just finished university or was that during university?
That was just when I finished, yeah.
And was it kind of a sense of like hit the floor running?
Pretty much.
And did you kind of understand the amounts of work and energy that would go into it?
Not at all, yeah. Well, I had an inkling, but it's something that's waxed and waned in terms of how much time I could devote to it, because Dread Empire is quite a monumental drafting project. It's intensely detailed. It's a technique that just requires a lot of penciling, a lot of hatching, and a lot of research. When it comes to, it's a very rich world that's going on. So it's sort of like a post-apocalyptic, Asian-themed, Lovecraftian kind of novel at the moment. I'm quite close to finishing it though, so I'm 2 pages away.
Amazing.
Which sounds like it's not very far, but it's still a lot of work.
Everyone I've mentioned to that you took on a graphic novel, especially artists kind of familiar with that genre, are really, really impressed, especially how far you've gone with it and your commitment, because I think a lot of people, as you say, aren't really sure of the realities of it and the amounts of work, and a couple of months and maybe even a year in, they just tap out. How have you kind of maintained it, and is it just something you want to get out there and hopefully that can kind of steer your career and grow into something?
Oh no, definitely. This is, I guess, a baby of mine, but it's one of those things when they say something's a labor of love. What that means is love in the real kind of relations and sense of love. Like there's stormy times, there's good times, and I think a lot of the times it's more about continuing with something when you've lost, I guess, the original love that you had for it. But my interest is still there. That's why I continue it. But it's not, the honeymoon phase is over because I've been doing it for, it's 2019, 2012, for like 7 years now. It's about 70 pages, but it's quite a long process. I can only work on it in my spare time. But it's something that I would recommend all youngsters who are going to pursue this, just to form communities of like-minded people around, because the work itself, by its nature, is quite isolating. So a lot of the time, you're drafting, you're in your own head, and it can get pretty dark. So it's very important not to forget that there are other people out there that you can connect with who can understand from this perspective what it's like psychologically. I think a lot of people, they just go into it and they think of it as being quite like a glossy thing, but it is a strange thing to do. It's not a normal kind of profession.
No, for sure. And I think with artists in general, all the weight's on them. It's not like a team dynamic where if there is a failure, that failure can be shared. So I think community is definitely a great thing where you need that support system. And that's why I love creative collectives like Eastside.
Yeah.
It's just that there's a bit of unity and a bit of community to kind of help carry everyone. But with a graphic novel, there is a bit of a team dynamic because you have the writer. The relationship between the writer and the artist, what's that like?
I guess it's like quite a different kind of, it's an intimate one when it comes to, I guess, idea sharing. I'd compare it in some ways to the relationship between an animator and an illustrator who's working on an animation project. It's just, when I say it's intimate, it's not like obviously intimate. It's just like you're very much showing the thing someone else is imagining, or maybe it is the relationship between a writer and an illustrator. So it's a shared world, and it's one that two people have come up with together. So that's not a standard thing, I guess.
And in terms of culture of these graphic novels in South Africa, is there a big audience? Or when it does come to launch and you have a product and it's something finished, would the strategy be to go globally? Will it kind of start off in Australia? Will you merge South Africa and Australia and try and punt in both locations?
Yeah, ideally both, and also Europe. The graphic novel Dread Empire, I think, is more suited to a European audience. And this is something I also wanted to explain, was the difference between European comics and American comics. With America, of course, you've had sort of Titanic,
like the
Marvels and the DCs, whereas Europe has more of a tradition of producing a lot more varied content out of the superhero genre.
Sure.
Like you've got a lot more. I mean, America has its own crime comics and things like that, but European comics dealt with a lot more zany concepts. I think they were far more influenced by psychedelics also than the American counterparts, although you do see that coming through, of course, with superhero comics as well, which are quite out there. I mean, the concept is Cape Crusaders fighting crime, but that, in a nutshell, the thing about superhero comics, which are great, that is the genre.
Yes.
The Cape Crusader fights crime in some way, and you can tinker around with that in all sorts of creative and fun ways. But I appreciated the more. It's almost like American comics stayed with teenagers for a long time, whereas Europeans understood that comics could also be read by adults.
I guess it could also be like with the nuance of European being made up of a lot more languages and cultures, and that kind of melting pot, breeds a bit more creative and fresh ideas. Where I think as America, there's a bit of that kind of solid unity, one goal, one language. So I think maybe the path is a bit more straight and narrow.
Maybe. They also had a different censorship culture back in the day. Like European comics had pornography. I mean, you still had pornographic American comics, but they were very underground. But yeah, the kinds of things that they would censor, they wouldn't have censored in European comics at the same time. It's just different cultural takes on the same thing. But in terms of your question with the local South African comic scene, there are a few people who do produce here, and their stories are, some of them are like local stories. I think, and that's great. I mean, I think the scene should grow here more, but again, it's about, a lot of it is a labor of love. It's not very commercially viable. I think the longest commercial big comic we had was Striker. I'm actually not sure if they're still running or not.
They are still going.
Yeah. But again, it's a lot of, you have to get sponsors. It's often around something locals are interested in, and I mean, Strikers has been, I think personally, like a great nurturing ground for a lot of other local South African comic book artists.
Well, definitely, yeah. It's a kind of an ambassador of a model that can work.
Yes.
And do you think, I mean, also in terms of an age thing, like our generation that are kind of entering the middle class, turning 30 now, growing up with anime and like Dragon Ball Z. Do you think that kind of also influences our taste, and in terms of opening the door up to things like graphic novels
Definitely.
And that type of appreciation?
Well, the manga angle of things is, I think, one of the more interesting, because here you've got content that's being consumed widely by another culture, produced by another far-off culture. I remember watching Dragon Ball Z and just looking forward to the next episode, even though they were super long and protracted. And I mean, how they...
Sure, yes. Yeah. And I mean, for all the good it's done, do you think there's also a kind of a dark side to that consumption of anime and how do you pronounce the word?
Manga.
Sorry.
Which are Japanese comics, yeah.
For sure. But in terms of, say, in high school, you have all these kids drawing anime, and, instead of, do you think that kind of...
Oh, the style bubble, you mean?
Yeah, the style bubble,
okay,
yeah.
That is a real thing. And you would see it at university, actually. Well, every now and again, it's like, I want to draw manga.
Yes.
And that's great that I think kids want to aspire to draw something as ambitious as a comic book or a manga series. But getting locked into style too soon is definitely an impediment, because the greatest manga artists, they understood the fundamentals of art before they went into stylization. So these are people who understand figure drawing, they understand perspective, they understand three-dimensional space. Stylization comes through trial and error and far later down the process. So yeah, that's something you see with a lot of young people and this is fine, is that as they start to emulate one of their art heroes. In this case, if we're talking about manga, they'll start maybe drawing, Dragon Ball Z art. But then that's all they end up knowing how to draw. And it's very difficult to, unlearn that once you've been doing it for a while. And it's not impossible. I mean, it's just, I think, and it's also not your voice. And that is the more interesting thing about you as an illustrator, is finding your illustration style, I guess, which I have to emphasize is a superfluous thing and something that will come with time and trial and effort, but it's something you will be recognized by. So it's important, but it's just something that will happen, and it's something not to be too angsty about, I think.
And kind of just going back, in terms of sharing similar stories, you also migrated to Cape Town, and you had to kind of hustle, and you took on a 9-to-5 job. And I think that was kind of a new territory for you, a kind of corporate structure. How did you navigate that? What did you learn? And I mean, how much of a shock was it to your kind of artistic sense?
Well, I think it was a great experience overall, working in a corporate environment. I think it is it's a thing that I think everyone should do at some stage, even if it's just for a short time, just to understand how production works, production pipelines work. It depends on what you want to do, but it gave me insight into how animation really functions, like just in terms of the pipeline and how you communicate, how the sum communicates with all the parts, really. I was really lucky. I had an amazing team to work with, and I learned a lot from that experience. So it's always good to do something that's initially a little bit outside of your comfort zone, because I think it adds to what you end up doing best at the end of the day, especially when it comes to art.
Oh, no, for sure. And we're going to wrap it up soon. Any advice for well, you've given actually a lot of advice, but kind of just closing thoughts or statement?
I guess if it's advice to young artists, is just don't let social media give you, don't rely too much on social media for where you should expect your career path should be going and when it will happen or how it's happening. I think that is a big thing. People looking too much at the end of the journey, focus on the small things that you can do now, and they're often very within reach. So yeah, get it, not being too influenced by online, just the creative community online, I think is a good thing.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, thanks, Simon, for being my first guest. And yeah.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on.
And thank you for listening. ArtPod is a South African-focused visual arts podcast hosted by Claude Chandler and produced by the generous assistance of Blended Podcasts, brought to you by Blended Audio.